Welcome back. Former apartheid President F.W. de Klerk's speech on the 2nd of February 1990 was seen as the last stand for the regime. The major announcements made that day are said to have changed the country's political landscape. They included the unbanning of political movements such as the ANC, as well as the release of political prisoners. In an opinion piece, political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki asks, how can we complete the process started by de Klerk? He joins me now to reflect more broadly then on the man and his spot in our history. Mr. Mbeki, very good evening to you. Thank you for coming in. So, 30 years on since that announcement by FW de Klerk, what is his legacy?
Well, de Klerk's major legacy, obviously, was the opening up of the political space, which had been closed since 1960 with the unbanning of the ANC and the PAC, and then the repression that followed during that period from 1960 onwards. The unbanning of the ANC and the PAC made it possible for the negotiations about the future of the country to happen. So that is really de Klerk's primary legacy, was that he had the courage, so to speak, to persuade his fellow National Party leaders that they have to discuss with the liberation movements.
But is that not often the problem with reflections on his legacy, that many people, especially, one would say, white South Africans and some of the people who took part in those negotiations that happened in the early 90s, often limit his legacy to the announcement of the 2nd of February 1990, and he's not held to account, some have argued, enough for his years spent as a member of the National Party and serving for that long, ultimately becoming its president before that announcement in 1990.
Yes, you know, we can argue until the cows come home as to whether de Klerk or Pig Botha or Magnus Malan or Adrian Flock should have been hanged, should have put against the wall and shot. Those who want to spend their time arguing those issues, they're of course free to make those point of view. The reality is there was an agreement between the National Party and the ANC, essentially, to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with the injury and the hurt that was suffered during the apartheid era, and that was the solution that was negotiated between the parties, and that was implemented.
But what do you think should have been done with figures like de Klerk, who for years were part of an oppressive, unjust and brutal regime?
Well, I was part of the ANC. I was part of COSATU. I was in exile with the ANC. That's what we agreed upon. And that's what I agreed. I lost family members whose bodies we still haven't found, but we had agreed that is how to settle the matter and to move forward to rebuild the country.
I'm not sure how much of the interviews you've seen with FW de Klerk, those done this past weekend. One that struck me is where he said, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, that the Nats did not have to make that announcement in 1990. They could have continued longer, but it was an assessment on their part, without pressure, that led to the announcement of the unbanning of the political movements and the release of the political prisoners. Is that an accurate reflection of history?
Yes, it is. It's an accurate reflection of the history of South Africa. The apartheid regime had one of the strongest armies in the world. They could mobilize and put in the field an army of 500,000 men within 2 weeks. They were fully armed. South Africa had a massive military industry which produced some of the most lethal artilleries, long-range artillery with a range of up to 40 kilometers. So, of course, they didn't have to do it on that day, and they were prepared. They had nuclear weapons. So they could stand their ground, but they felt that they were strong enough to negotiate from strength rather than negotiating from weakness. That is what many people don't understand, is that they were negotiating from strength. For example, Umkhonto we Sizwe had been evicted out of Angola as part of the the settlement of the Namibia independence issue. So it had been evicted from Angola and had been moved up to Uganda. So the National Party was negotiating from a position of strength, and on the whole, I think they got what they wanted.
So you don't think that he was given too much credit for the events at the time?
Well, I think in the discussion that is happening today, too many people are focusing on individuals. De Klerk was president of South Africa. He had a cabinet, he had a political party. Mandela was president of the ANC. He had a cabinet, he had a political party. He wasn't the individual who saved South Africa. Neither de Klerk was, nor Mandela. These were they were members, prominent members of institutions. The National Party was an institution. The ANC was an institution. It's those institutions that made the decisions.
You don't become president of an organization, president of a country that was racist and brutal towards black people without being an embodiment of what it stood for. So to that extent, he should then be judged for the period that he held on to those values, because there was a point in his life pre-1990 and 94 where he believed in what the Nats stood for.
Yes, but that's the job for the historians. It's not my job. It's for the historians to judge what de Klerk did with his life, to look into his biography, to look into the records. Remember, there are records which are, for example, are not open to the public for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So until the historians get into that, most of the judgment that is being made really is an emotional judgment that's not based on any fact.
But it was a lived reality, and lived realities are by their nature emotional, and you cannot run on fact alone when you're dealing with decades of oppression, suffering, and abuse of a people.
Yes, we have to understand we had a war, but we can't revel in the suffering that we suffer. Do we want to revel on the suffering, or do we want to rebuild South Africa? To me...
Is it impossible to do both?
It is more or less impossible to do both. The past, we have historians. South Africa has eminent historians. They will write the real story. The documents that are classified today will be declassified, and then we will eventually get to the true story. But that's the job of the historian.
Moving forward then, because again, every time F.W. de Klerk's name comes up, we go back to that shared Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela and whether he was worthy of that stage. Do you think he was?
Well, that was the decision of the Nobel Committee.
But do you agree with the decision?
Yes, I agreed with the decision. Remember, Mandela could have refused. The ANC could have said, you, Mandela, don't reject the Nobel Prize. The ANC agreed to it. Mandela didn't just do it all by himself. So this was agreed. People misunderstand that many of the things like the sharing of the Nobel Prize, we agreed to it. The Constitution of South Africa, the ANC agreed to it, ANC members agreed to it.
I'm glad you say the ANC agreed to it, because again, another criticism of the ANC's decisions at the time was that it over-negotiated and agreed to things that ultimately did not help the position and the healing, to an extent, of the people that it was fighting alongside and for, to an extent.
Well, you know, that's why I'm saying we can talk about these things until the cows come home. The reality is that we had a certain balance of power during that 4 years of negotiations. And the ANC leadership had to evaluate what was it that they could get out of the negotiations, and so did the National Party.
But did the ANC of the time negotiate fairly and hard enough? Did they get the best deal?
To me, they got the best deal, given their strength. Given the strength of the ANC, I think they got a very good deal. We got a democratic election, and they got control of the army. The army did not rise. And they are now the government of South Africa. So, to me, the ANC got a good deal. We didn't have the kind of conflict that was many people thought we would get in order to that our negotiations would end up in a stalemate. So I think the ANC got a reasonable deal under the circumstances.
Let's go back to FW de Klerk then, because over the years the FW de Klerk Foundation has spoken quite vocally, and he himself has spoken at various events about the running of the government and everything that's happened, especially in the last 10 years. What moral standing does he have to make any judgment on the running of a government, given his history?
Well, I'm very nervous about playing God here, because you are asking me to play God.
I'm asking for your thoughts on whether he should actually be making any moral judgments on anyone's leadership, given that some of the mistakes committed during the time when he was part of government were deadly.
Yes, but as a South African citizen, he is at liberty to express his point of view about anything that goes on in the country, as long as he's not advocating violence, as long as he's not insulting the races of the people of South Africa. And he's at liberty to do so. Many people may think he shouldn't be at liberty he shouldn't be entitled to the same democratic rights as you and me, but
of course, you and I did not lead an apartheid government. That's the difference.
Oh, absolutely we didn't. But we have the same rights as de Klerk, and you and me have the same rights under our constitution.
But there's a different context. I want you to stand by for me. Political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki is still with me as we continue to go through the legacy of the former apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk. In a moment, we'll go into Mr. Mbeki's article penned about de Klerk and the way forward for the country. This is Nightline. Stay with us.